Hi everybody and welcome to today's meeting on the economics of biodiversity and also a bit on the ESA. There's a lot to get through in this meeting and it's actually one that, in this lecture, and it's actually one that's I have quite a personal vested interest in. Now we're in more the sort of sustainability side of this class rather than focusing on the biodiversity side. It's a lot more, so there is still obviously hard science in it, but sort of personal opinions and internal biases start to become important as well. So let's crack on. I'm going to share my screen. Let's find which one I'm after. Of course, as per usual, too many things open. Here we go. Okay, so by the end of this class, you guys should be able to list some of the ways biodiversity can be valued, critique whether or not trying to place a value on diversity is actually a good idea at all. 3, discuss the success of the ESA, or the Endangered Species Act, in protecting diversity. Okay. So we're going to, I'll put my laser pointer on as well. So we're going to start off with asking, what is the dollar value of biodiversity? So we know that biodiversity is important. We know it's important because we've talked about it in terms of drug discovery, ecosystem functioning, just the moral obligation and the intrinsic value of diversity. But can we place a dollar value on it? You know, what is the dollar value of a coral reef? We can all look at a coral reef and go, oh, that's very nice, it's very pretty, it's very beautiful. But can we put a dollar value on it? Or a rainforest? Or a polar bear? And this is not necessarily an easy thing to calculate. So we might ask about, well, if it's not easy to calculate, well, why should we do it? And the sort of immediate answer to that is, well, if you put a dollar value on something, it becomes easy to convey how important it is to people that might not necessarily have any interest in biodiversity. If you take a Wall Street banker and you say, oh, coral reefs are important because they do ecosystem functions and they do this and they sequester carbon and all this kind of jazz, they're not going to care in the slightest. But if you say, well, coral reef is important because it's worth this many dollars, that's a language they immediately speak and they start to understand it. So that's one of the things we do it, even though it's not necessarily easy to calculate. However, there is one way that we can place an actual dollar value on individual animals, and that is trophy hunting. And I just wanted to start off with just a quick clicker question. It's a fake clicker question, so you know you're going to be doing it on your own, but just think about, what is your opinion of trophy hunting? A, we have the right to harvest any species on any continent for purely decorative purposes for any reason. B, I'm for it under strictly managed circumstances if it benefits local wildlife. C, I have no opinion either way. D, I fundamentally disagree with it. E, I'm actively against it and I have protested, contacted politicians to express my distaste. Okay? Right, let's have a think. Well, I'm going to tell you about my personal opinion to start with, because I've been through a sort of fair few changes on this. So a few years ago, was very much E. I was very actively against trophy hunting. I've been to Africa a number of times. The wildlife there is absolutely staggering, and there's always these big, flagship, news articles about terrible things happening in trophy hunting. So I was in E. I've actually switched a bit and gone more into a combination of E and B. I still have some issues with trophy hunting, but I understand that it can be very important and it can be very positive if it's strictly managed. I still have some issues with it, like photos like the one shown here. I just find so absolutely just horrendously distasteful, this idea that, there should be some element of fair choice. There should be a stalking, who knows? But, this animal that's been killed was obviously not tracked on foot. Chances are it was actually shot from a Land Rover, which is what happens an awful lot. I'll let you make up your own minds as to why I believe that. But I still have an issue with some cases, the way that it's managed and stuff that's gone on. Okay, but let's talk about it a little bit. So first of all, we're talking about what is the dollar value of biodiversity. And this is the story that really sort of put me into one of the stories that reinforced my personal opinions about, okay, it should be E, I'm utterly against it, and I was actually involved in protesting against it. And it was this package. So this is, anyone recognise this? This is Cecil the lion. Cecil the lion was the dominant male in a pride in a place called Wangi Safari Park in Zimbabwe. And he was killed by this dentist from Minnesota a few years ago. Now, the package that was sold to the dentist to take Cecil the lion cost $55,000 US. So that is a huge amount of money in a poor nation. So in terms of the amount of money going, when we first, one of the ways these sort of things were justified was, well, look, it's an enormous amount of money going into the nation of Zimbabwe. But where did this money go? Well, for one, these luxury hunting packages often pay very little of the total value of the hunt to the country in which they take place. In terms of Cecil, the amount of money that actually went to Wangi National Park, where Cecil was from, was nothing. Not a penny went to Wangi National Park originally. The reason for that is because this was a very, very dodgy hunt indeed. Although Cecil was the head of the pride in Wangi National Park, these guys killed an impala and then placed the impala literally 50 meters outside of the border of Wangi National Park and sat next to the impala waiting for a lion to come out of the park. And the moment Cecil came out of the park, he was shot with a bow. And bow hunting for lion has increased in popularity an awful lot in Zimbabwe for one obvious reason, and that is bows don't make any noise. So in many cases, these hunts that are taking place, that are meant to be taking place on private hunting conservancies, are actually taking place within the boundaries of national parks, because the hunting guide takes their client just into the boundary of the national park, and then because they're using a bow to hunt it, the bow makes no noise. It doesn't alert people in the park the fact there's hunting going on inside the park or near to the park. And also, the way that bow hunting for lion works is you do not kill the lion instantly. The lion is hit, and then you have to follow the blood trail for a very long time. Because of that, it means that it's very hard to prove where the original shot took place. It's entirely possible that the lion could have first been hit outside the national park and then walked into the national park while bleeding, or it could have been shot inside the national park. It's very, very difficult to tell where it was originally hit. So it's pretty ropey, the fact that this bow hunting, the main driver for it has been the fact of the silence, and it's easy to hunt sort of guerrilla style, essentially. And also, in addition to all of this financial sort of jiggery-pokery that was going on, from the moral perspective, well, Cecil was taken with a bow and took over 40 hours to die. He literally bled to death over the course of 40 hours, which is just unreal, the fact that that sort of thing is allowed to take place. So it was really kind of distasteful. So it's very easy to see why people can be very upset with trophy hunting in Africa. You know, people coming into a foreign country, taking this animal, taking it borderline legally, not really if you're honest, and also the animal died in just horrendous circumstances. But then you compare that to some other situations. So for example, this is Corey Knowlton. Corey Knowlton is part of the Dallas Safari Club, which is a big group out of Texas. And Corey Knowlton, a few years ago, actually won an auction to hunt a black rhino, which initially is just crazy. Black rhino are one of the most endangered species on the planet. They're a huge conservation icon. People have been working hard for decades to try and keep these things alive, and yet they allowed one to be hunted. But in this case, it was a very well-managed hunt. The reason this was offered at all by a national park in Namibia is because they had a problem rhino. It was a large female who was past her reproductive age, so she was no longer fertile, she couldn't reproduce anymore, and she was bullying other rhino to the extent where she was impeding the reproduction of other individuals of the species. She was just being a nuisance, she was attacking other females, being very territorial, and so she's negatively impacting conservation efforts. It was very legal. There were concerns about whether or not this whole hunt legitimized the rhino hunt and trade, but, you know, it's harder to argue because in this case, $350,000 went directly to conservation trusts activity in Namibia. So it was paid directly to conservation activities in Namibia, the entire dollar value. And that dollar value is roughly equivalent to 100,000 park visitors, or 1/10 of the annual visits to all the national parks in Namibia. So at that point you say, okay, that is a massive injection of money to conservation efforts. It becomes a bit harder to completely dismiss trophy hunting on this basis. In addition, this was a very well managed hunt. It was literally a person walked out with Corey Knowlton to find the exact rhino they were going to take, shot with a rifle, instantly dead. Okay, so morally it's a little bit better. And one of the questions then becomes, well, what about the role of trophy hunting in a nation without real government oversight? And we're going to talk about the nation of Zimbabwe, which is a place I've been to a few times. Now, Zimbabwe is an incredible country. It's highly fertile and very biodiverse. It was known as the Garden of Africa. It's just an insanely fertile place. It's also got an incredibly corrupt government, unfortunately, one of the most corrupt in Africa. And the government see national parks, and national parks are seen by the government as revenue sources. The national parks in Africa work slightly differently. Unlike national parks sort of in the US, where the federal government pays money to maintain and look after these national parks, in Zimbabwe, the national parks, they're seen as a source of government revenue. They must generate money. If they don't generate money, then they start becoming something else. They get used for some other reason. And unfortunately, there's no real incentive to stop poaching, because in some ways poaching actually generates money. It's a way that the national parks can get money. So how do you then what is the role of trophy hunting in a nation without this government oversight? And so what's happened in Zimbabwe is the rise of private conservancies. And one of the biggest of these is a place called Bube Conservancy in Zimbabwe. So Bube Conservancy is a massive privately owned hunting conservancy. It operates outside of government oversight. So it's a private consortium. The government has no oversight in the management and the way this park works. It is a gigantic ranch, essentially. It's now 850,000 acres of restored wild bushland. It was previously a cattle ranch. The reason Bube exists is because it was originally the cattle ranch that was used to produce bully beef in the Second World War. So the beef that was given to the Allied soldiers that sustained them while they were fighting the Second World War was produced on this ranch. So it was a gigantic ranch. The ranch owners became very wealthy, and eventually the ranch was turned over. They restored the land, took the cattle off it, restored it back to a natural condition, and it is now this gigantic privately owned hunting conservancy. And Bube was developed with a mentality of high value, low density hunting. So the animals themselves live wild on the land. Unlike many other hunting conservancies where they're what they call canned hunts, where the animals are essentially in paddocks and you walk into which paddock you want to hunt and go and shoot it, here they live wild. But people are intensely managed. So they are incredibly tight on who can come in, who can hunt, and how those hunts are managed. I have a friend that's worked at Bube a few times, and he gave me some stories. So the way that Bube works is you have to, if you're a hunting guide, you have to have a radio on you the whole time, and you have to radio in every single shot that's taken. So when the client is given a permit to hunt in Bube, they're given a very specific location where they can hunt. They start off in the camp. They head out from their camp to their very specific location where they've been told to hunt and the animals they've got permits for. The guide stands there, and the moment the shot is fired, the guide instantly radios in to say where that shot was fired from, who they are, where they are, the permits, what's happened, and they have to do that instantly. If they don't do that, or any part of that is not above board, a helicopter is instantly dispatched from the location, from the central office, to the location of the gunshot. They find where the gunshot's gone on, they go screaming in with the helicopter, and heavily armed guys will jump out of the helicopter, put everyone on the floor and demand to know what's going on. A friend of mine this actually happened to because he was out with a client. They had permits to go and hunt something in one location. The client decided on the way there to shoot at a tin can that he'd seen from the side of the Land Rover. So, of course, fired a shot in a location where they shouldn't have been fired. A shot should not have been fired. Helicopter was dispatched. They had everybody on the ground at gunpoint. The guy that was the guide was even saying, like, look, guys, it's me. Like, you know me. You know I'm supposed to be here. And they were just like, yep, we know, but this is the process and this is what we do. So it's intensely managed. As a result of its intense management, it's now been very successful in raising wildlife. So Bubé has over 500 lion on its property. This is a huge density of lion, to the extent where they have problem lion that they are actively going out and shooting. They also have black and white rhino that have been translocated from government parks. Bubé, because of the amount of revenue it's generating and because the people are so intensely managed and because they have the security in terms of helicopters, it's one of the few places where rhino can live in safety because they have such high levels of guardianship that the rhino are safe from poaching. These rhino have actually been translocated in from government parks that don't have the resources to look after them. So Bubé has now got the highest wildlife diversity and density in southern Africa, and it's an example of excellent wildlife management in a very difficult nation. And one thing that's worth looking at, the reason they've been able to be so successful is because you look at their packages. So here are the hunting packages offered at Bubé. So it says this is just about all of them. You've got the safari, you've got all the different animals, and you've got how many days. The daily rate is also in US dollars. For these daily rates, you have to buy the entire package. So, for example, if you want a lion and a buffalo hunt, it's an 18-day hunt. The daily rate is $3,000. The total is $54,000. You pay that in advance, and if you end up getting both your lion and your buffalo on day 2, if you want, you can stay out to go and look at the wildlife, or you can go back, but you are still paying that full amount. You are not paying anything less. You look at some of these prices, so they have things like lion and double buffalo. So of those double buffalo, one will be a trophy animal, one will be a management animal. This is a problem buffalo that's being a bit of a pain. They also do the price of a management lion, buffaloes and leopards and sable, all these sorts of things. Now, what is the one animal that you don't see on here, which you might be a little bit surprised about? Well, remember, Bubé has translocated black and white rhino into the Conservancy from national parks. But even on their hunting list, there's no mention of rhino. This is because you can't hunt the rhino on Bubé. Bubé, even though those rhino cost an awful lot to manage and look after because of the poaching issue, they still won't generate money from hunting off them because they see the value of it in just pure conservation. So as a result, their most difficult to manage species is the one they don't make any hunting revenue off. They just still see the value of having these resources and maintaining their rhino. So at that point, it's a bit harder to be immediately against trophy hunting because it's allowing the maintenance and survival of a species in a hunting conservancy, even though it isn't being hunted, but it's the hunting of other animals that's allowing it to survive. So you compare Bubé to some other outfits. So for example, this is the owner Jimmy John's Sandwiches, and this was the last black rhino in Namibia's Mangeti National Park, which this guy paid a load of money to shoot. So this, you sort of say, okay, there is good and bad, certainly. But now let's talk a little bit about my trophy hunting trips. So here's me. This is a picture taken in 2017 on one of the trips we went on. This is John, a guy I've known for a little while. He works as a guide and an anti-poaching officer out there. And I often go out to a place called Mana Pools in northern Zimbabwe. We go to Mana Pools for one major reason, and that is Mana Pools is the least developed park in southern Africa. So you are not allowed to build any permanent structures inside the boundaries of Mana Pools. So no buildings that can't be taken down. So as a result, you're continuously living in camps and tents. And one of the other things it does, which is very unique, is allows walking safari. So unlike most of these outfits where you are traveling around in Land Rovers and Toyota Land Cruisers and you're in a big train of cars driving the park, in Mana Pools, you are literally allowed to get out your truck and wander about and walk and track animals. And the trophies that I'm looking for are things like this. So these are photos that I've taken on these walking safaris in Mana Pools. This is one of the big elephants. His name is Boswell. He is the largest elephant in the park. He has some of the biggest tusks of any elephant in southern Africa. So each one of those tusks weighs about 70 pounds. So he's got 140 pounds of ivory attached to his face, which the dollar value of that is just insane. And we approached these guys on foot. Every now and again, you get a little bit too close to ones. This is one of the elephants who decided we were a little bit too close and gave us a bluff charge. You can see with the ears going out. But one of the other crazy things that you can do in monopools is walk with lion. So this is a male lion that we'd been walking for about 5 or 6 kilometers and then came up on him. And we got to within 50 meters, which is, what's that in real money, about 150 feet of him. So we approached him on foot. At this point, we're miles away from the truck, miles away from the camp, and you're literally staring down an eyeball to eyeball with a lion in the middle of Africa. And, you know, people go on hunts and they talk about the bravery of, you know, the adrenaline of walking after a lion with a gun on foot. And the photography community says, well, what's the one thing braver than tracking a lion with a gun on foot? And it's like leaving the gun at home. So this was unarmed, walking up and going and finding lion. This is some of the pictures. So this was a slightly out of focus shot that a friend of mine took when we were out there. So here's me on the way back, and here's a female lion, a lioness that we'd just been hanging around with. We got to spend about 3/4 of an hour with her just hanging out. So it's a pretty incredible place. The one thing out there that does kind of freak me out are the Cape buffalo. These are affectionately known as the Black Death. And they are really nasty pieces of work. And having sights like this, where you literally have a herd of Cape buffalo staring you down when you're on foot, is a little bit unnerving. And these photography trips have become really, really popular. So in Bubé Conservancy, Bubé is primarily a hunting conservancy. So the wildlife are managed in such a way that it generates a lot of revenue from hunting. But Bubé now has such a high density and diversity of wildlife that photography trips in the hunting conservancy are a major revenue stream. So these are trips where you pay money to stay at the camps, and they often separate the photographers and the hunters, but you don't buy the hunting permits, you're not taking any animals, you're just literally taking out pictures. And Bubé, because of its high density of wildlife, there's talk of trying to start something really special. So these are 2 friends of ours, Carl and Montana, who work out in Zimbabwe. And Mana Pools National Park has moved its black rhino out. It did that a long time ago. But Carl and Montana are talking about trying to start walking with rhino in Bubé, because Bubé is one of the few places that has black and white rhino. These guys do walking with lion in Mana Pools. So they're talking about, well, why can't we do walking with rhino, which would be an amazing experience. But with these sorts of things, well, Africa is one thing when it comes to trophy hunting, and hunting generally, but what about back here in the Intermountain West? You know, the Intermountain West has a really strong hunting and fishing tradition. It also has the highest amount of public land in the lower 48 states. We have an enormous amount of public land, and there's this big tradition of using the public land for hunting, especially. So when we talk about hunting in the Intermountain West, well, well-managed hunting can sustainably generate cash from biodiversity. It's possible to continuously generate a good amount of money from these sort of outfits through the harvesting of biodiversity. And crucially, the breeding system in ruminants allows harvest. So ruminants are things like deer, elk, pronghorn, all those sorts of guys. Now, the breeding system in these species really is a good setup for harvesting, because predominantly people want to hunt the males, the bucks, and the vast majority of bucks never breed. You can collect, and remember, 50% just 50% of the individuals in the species for mammals are going to be male. Most of those males never breed. They're sort of reproductively useless because they're not dominant individuals. So you can harvest a large amount of those males, remove them out of the population without impacting the number of deer being produced at all, because the number of deer being produced is determined by the number of females, not by the number of males. One male can impregnate hundreds of females. So you can harvest an awful lot of them without impacting the population, and maintaining a healthy population of animals and generating revenue at the same time. Because here in Utah, about 46%, so that's nearly $40 million of the Division of Wildlife Resources revenue comes from hunting and fishing permits and licenses. Now, all this money stays in Utah, and it facilitates the management of natural areas. It's specifically done to manage and make sure our wild areas stay wild. So it's a relatively good system, and it generally has an awful lot of biodiversity benefits. However, hunting, in addition to being used as a management tool, can be used as a political tool and essentially become a cull. So, for example, in 2013, the state of Montana issued 6,000 wolf permits that would allow the killing of 30,000 wolves on public lands. Now, at the time, there were only 625 wolves in the entire state. So that is not a managed hunt, that is not a sustainable hunt, that is a cull at that point. And the crucial questions you want to be thinking about for hunting is, well, you've got the biological questions. Well, is it legal? Can the population of animals cope with the harvest? Is the money benefiting the right people or entities? Then you also have the moral questions. Will the animal be killed humanely? What is motivating the desire to hunt? Am I being truthful with myself? Now, hunting is one way, but there are other ways to measure the dollar value of biodiversity. For example, industrial harvesting. So, marine fisheries are a large-scale industrial harvest of biodiversity. Now, these fisheries generate revenue, but fisheries critically require clean, healthy oceans. And this means that we can place a dollar value on pristine ecosystems. Unlike trophy hunting and the taking of single animals, where we're placing a dollar value on the individual animal, for fisheries, we're often placing a dollar value on entire healthy oceanic ecosystems. Now, in the case of salmon, we must also protect rivers for spawning and lakes for rearing. So when we want to maintain a healthy salmon harvest, we not only need healthy oceans, but we also need healthy lakes and rivers. So it can have quite a big impact on maintaining healthy, pristine areas of biodiversity. Fisheries must, however, be regulated. And if they're not regulated well, we can get serious collapse. So the biggest fisheries collapse ever was the Newfoundland cod off the Grand Banks of eastern Canada. So this is the catches of northern cod. You can see it went along, everything was ticking along just fine. Then we had the invention of industrial fishing in the 1960s, where it went from being small boats to these massive factory ships out in the open ocean. The catch skyrocketed for a couple of years, and then it massively plummeted, and now it's entirely collapsed. There is no Newfoundland Grand Banks cod fishery anymore. It's gone. Now, unfortunately, sharks are actually going the same way. So if we look at, this is the percent of historic populations and what size they're all at. So hammerheads have declined from 89% of their historic maximum. White shark are down 80%. Tiger shark down 65%. Grey sharks are up to 83%. No one quite knows. Threshers have dropped by over 80%. Blue shark dropped by 60%. Mako shark's doing great. They've only dropped by 5%. And oceanic white tips, which is a sort of educated guess at best, dropped 70%. So although we have observed these massive fishing collapses historically, we are also observing them in the modern world as well. And to the question about, we start to raise this question about how to regulate a valuable natural commodity. And we have this we're wrestling with this idea of bans versus changing people's perceptions. Because in terms of especially the shark harvest, shark fin is incredibly valuable for shark fin soup. The global trade is at one point it was the biggest illegal global trade. It was a bigger trade than heroin, was the illegal trading of shark fins. And so they tried to ban it, that didn't really work. So instead they moved to a sort of changing perceptions mentality. And I'm just going to show you a video. It's this YouTube video here. Let's just stop this share and start the next one. Let's see, where's it at? Here we go. These links are in as well, so I'll show you in. So this was some of the videos they started releasing to change people's perception.
What if you could see how shark fin soup is made? If you could see how each year up to 70 million sharks are killed to end up in soup, could you still eat it? A third of all shark species are nearly extinct, but we can help save them.
Remember, when the buying stops, the killing can too.
So this is one of a whole series. Let's have a look of these sorts. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. Share screen. Whole series of these videos where bans weren't working, so instead they worked on changing people's perceptions. In the case of shark fin, it actually worked quite spectacularly. Sales of shark fin soup in China dropped by up to 70% in a few years, even after a ban hadn't had any real effect, but just by these changing public perceptions. One of the other examples of this is in rhino horn. So rhino horn is one of these things where it was a huge deal in the 80s, then in the 90s and early 2000s, sales of rhino, like the trade in rhino horn, just dropped right off. Then, starting about 2007, for some reason, rhino horn went screaming up again in terms of trade because it started to be used in for medicinal purposes. Now, there's been a complete ban on rhino horn for decades, but there are some loopholes and some weird things going on. So, for example, these two rhino horn were taken from a single individual, was sold in 2015, well after the ban. They were sold through a popular online auction site, and they was able to sell them because they called it an antique auction. They were able to say, oh, these aren't new rhino horn, these are really quite old, so we're going to sell them as antiques. They weren't sold as rhino horn, they were sold as antiques. And there's a little bit of this sort of thing starting to go on. And the trade in rhino horn is so valuable. Rhino horn is actually more valuable than cocaine or gold. So it's a hugely valuable commodity, to the extent where this is the rhino, the stuffed rhino that is in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. And this is a plaque telling you that the horn on the front of it is fake. They removed the rhino horn off their museum specimen and replaced it with a plastic one because they were so scared about somebody breaking in and stealing the rhino horn. Now that's something that actually happened in a few places in Europe. So in the Natural History Museum of London, they have the same situation. It's a fake rhino horn. And sales and demand for rhino horn are increasing despite bans and other efforts. And so due to the failure of bans, there's now a campaign to change attitudes, which was inspired by the success of the shark fin campaign, which I will just show you now here. Let's show you again this video. So here we go.
If you're buying rhino horn, you may be paying for more than just horn. You're paying for guns, bullets, poison arrows, chainsaw, axes, and machetes to hack off the face of the rhino. And you are paying for the life of a beautiful creature. So please tell your friends and relatives, never buy products made from rhino horn. When the buying stops, the killing can too.
Now, I've shown you two of these videos now, both produced by the same people, by Wild Aid originally. Let me just go back to sharing screen. And what's the things that we notice about these? There's a couple of parallels in these videos. First of all, they both use major celebrities that have been very successful in the US, and they're both written in English. So although they're often not targeted at an English-speaking market, they produce English versions of them because, as well as ones in other languages, because producing English ones, it gives it a sort of more international feel, And as a result, people don't feel they're being vindicated and identified and pointed out villainized quite so badly. So as a result, it's these sort of clever psychological tricks to try and help. And these sort of promotional campaigns do help a fair bit. They are reducing some of the demand for rhino horn, certainly shark fin soup. And what's amazing is that it's following a ban, this changing of perceptions actually started to have some effect. Because in many cases, the moment you ban something, what you actually do is make it more valuable to certain people. So it's just a psychological aspect. So other ways to measure the dollar value of biodiversity is what we call missed opportunity costs. So we talk about this in terms of what revenue are we willing to lose to protect biodiversity. And we'll talk about the example of what's called the Northern Gateway Pipeline. So the Northern Gateway Pipeline was proposed in the mid-2000s to move Albertan oil in Canada to a place called Kitimat in British Columbia, where it could then be shipped across the Pacific. So this is sort of Western Canada here. Here are the tar sands of Alberta, and the Northern Gateway Pipeline was a huge pipeline. The idea was you could take it out here, it would then meet up with tankers in Kitimat, and then this is the Pacific Ocean. It could then be sold to the Asian markets, which, you know, one of the biggest markets in the world. So it was a way of delivering Canadian oil to Asia, which would have been a big deal. However, this pipeline was hugely controversial, and the main reason was it passed through an area called the Great Bear Rainforest. So this is the Great Bear Rainforest. It's home to this really quite special animal. This is called the spirit bear. So this is actually a black bear. It's not a polar bear, but there's a group of black bears as a subspecies in the Great Bear Rainforest that have this genetic mutation whereby some of the females are white. They come out bright white. So this is a female with her two cubs. The two cubs do not have the mutation, so they've come out black and she is white. So these are affectionately known as the spirit bears, and the only place they exist is in this Great Bear Rainforest. In addition, this is a huge Pacific salmon producing region. So the ocean itself is a big rearing place for salmon as adults, and they spawn and use these rivers all the way through British Columbia in order to raise. So although this would have generated a lot of money, this pipeline, in terms of tax revenue and things like that, it would have gone through two very important pristine biological habitats. And the company that made it, Enbridge, did this massive public relations campaign to demonstrate the safety of the project. It was pretty staggering how badly it was received. So there was a bike ride in Canada called the Ride to Conquer Cancer. It's been going for decades. It's usually a big international event. Everybody comes and you do this massive bike ride and you get sponsored to conquer cancer. One year, Enbridge decided to sponsor the event and said, oh, we'll give you a load of money so you can put Enbridge, and so people like associate our name with this very positive thing that takes place. What actually happened is the number of people who registered to ride the year that Enbridge did it plummeted. Nobody wanted to be associated with it. So Enbridge was so toxic that people were like, no, I don't want to cure cancer if Enbridge is associated with it. So it was really, really toxic. Now, this campaign, I'll show you one of the videos from the campaign. Again, it's here, because I want to show you a couple of things about it. So let's have a look. So here is the original video, one of the videos that Enbridge put out to show how clever it's going to be. So it's got no sound on it, so I'll just do a little bit of commentary. So look at Enbridge, look at their lovely logo. Green leaves, we're green, we're good, we're natural. We're not just a massive oil producer. So here's their computer-generated video. We start off just near Edmonton in Alberta, and here's the route of the pipeline. So we start out, the pipeline goes through these little townships. There's a happy little plane flying by for absolutely no reason. It goes along through this bit of the forest. It goes over the Rocky Mountains, goes through a place called Bear Lake. There's Prince George in British Columbia. This now in the Great Bear Rainforest. We're in the coastal mountains, going through terrace. And it drops down into this place called Kitimat, and from here it meets a happy little tanker and it sails out through the Douglas Channel. Okay, so here's the happy little tanker coming to collect it from the refinery, and off it goes. This is crucial. The animation is for illustrative purposes only. It is meant to be broadly representative, not to scale. That's critical because I want to draw your attention to something, just to re-highlight it. So here it comes. This is the end of the pipeline at Kitimat. This is the Pacific Ocean. So you can see this pipeline comes down, and look at the Douglas Channel where it comes out. It's beautiful. Lovely, big, open expanse of water you can get your tanker in and out of. So why was that so controversial? Well, let me just go back to sharing the PowerPoint. Let's have a look. So, this PR campaign was a massive disaster, and they were accused of deceiving the public. Because this is a screen grab from that video. We can see here's the Douglas Channel, lovely big expanse of water. If you go to Google Earth, here's what that area actually looks like. So here's Kitimat. You will notice this is not a big open expanse of water. This is an incredibly difficult to navigate series of channels through islands. Because their video had entirely removed the Hawkesbury's, the Gribbles, the Gill and the Campania Islands from the Douglas Channel. They made it look like, oh, this is going to be super easy. This is one of the hardest pieces of water to navigate in the world. It's incredibly stormy, it's incredibly rocky, it's very difficult to move large tankers through it. So as a result, they were told, this is not representative. You're trying to demonstrate to people this is going to be safe and easy, and it is not. In addition, it turned out the whole thing would have only created 213 jobs. So it was kind of canned after that. So in 2014, the Harper government, so Stephen Harper's government, approved the Northern Gateway Pipeline project. But upon taking office in 2015, Justin Trudeau, the new Prime Minister, banned tankers in northern British Columbia. He said it's too dangerous to navigate these big tankers around, so got rid of them. And in 2016, the Trudeau government finally officially rejected the plans. So the Northern Gateway was canned. So we could then start to think about, this risk to biodiversity versus jobs, pipelines are often a flashpoint. And one of the ones that happened and still occurring a bit closer to us is the Dakota Access Pipeline. So Dakota Access Pipeline is another oil pipeline. It passes through some natural areas and it passes through land owned by sort of indigenous tribes, and it's become hugely controversial. And there's a couple of reasons why it became so controversial. So in April 2016 to 2017, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe led a protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And the main thing they were initially very angry about was the changing of the route, because this dashed line is the original route, the original proposed route. However, this original route was moved because it was considered a threat to the water supply for the Missouri River to the town of Bismarck. So there's a town, a sort of standard normal town, here's the pipeline, and it was considered the fact that the pipeline crosses through this one river means it poses a threat to the water supply. So they moved the pipeline. They moved the pipeline from here, and here's the new route. So the thing with the new route is it goes through, as we showed here, let me just see. So it's now, the new route goes through not one river, but it goes through archaeological sites, it goes through native water, and it goes through camps. The original route went through one river, and that was said, no, that's too risky. So the new route now goes through 1, 2, 3, 4 rivers, but these are rivers on native land, so it's considered fine. So it's been hugely controversial because rather than going through one river because one river is too dangerous, it's considered okay to go through 4 rivers because it's not going through a town, instead it's going through native land. So as a result, they were kind of upset about this. They started leading this big protest. Violence was used against them, including dogs and water cannons. This has also became incredibly controversial. But it went ahead anyway. In April 2017, the pipeline itself was completed. In May 2017, the first oil was delivered through the pipeline. In November of 2017, the first major spill occurred associated with this pipeline. 210,000 gallons of crude oil were dumped into a river, destroying the fishing habitat, destroying an awful lot of this native land. So less than 6 months after the first bit of oil went through, there was a major spill. So pretty much on the anniversary of the time when they were being tasered and had violence used against them for protesting that it threatened their water. They were moved because their water had been polluted. Now, there are other ways also of measuring the value of biodiversity, and one of these is through carbon credits. So carbon credits and things like cap and trade actually place a dollar value on ecosystem services. Rather than placing a dollar value on an animal or pristine ecosystems, they place a dollar value on ecosystem services, and specifically the ability of ecosystems to sequester carbon. And these carbon credits, well, they can be traded like any other goods and services. They're even traded on the stock market. Now, the thing with carbon credits is they're very susceptible to market forces and political will. In many cases, if you don't have to buy carbon credits to offset the carbon that your industry produces, well, you have no reason to. Businesses are set up to make money, and if you can do anything to save money, you will do it. And if you don't have to buy carbon credits, or you realize that buying carbon credits doesn't actually buy you much political goodwill, so it's not worth doing it to increase revenue, you just don't do it. If you don't have to, you won't. Now, one of the craziest examples of this was Kyoto. So this is a place, this is in Borneo. So if President Bush, we'll go back a while now, had signed the Kyoto Agreement. So the Kyoto Agreement was this agreement that was going to make it mandatory globally to buy carbon credits for the carbon dioxide that your industry produces. If he had signed this, primary rainforest would have been Malaysia and Indonesia's most valuable crop, because the amount of revenue you could generate through essentially maintaining pristine tropical rainforest would be so high, because it generates, because it sequesters so much carbon dioxide, it would have been the most valuable crop you could grow in Malaysia and Indonesia. But he didn't sign it, and instead the most valuable crop was palm oil. And instead of these forests being maintained in order to be as carbon sequesters, they were cut down, and instead it was turned into this highly destructive palm oil plantation. Another way we can look at this, the value of biodiversity, is in tourism. So the Great Barrier Reef off the east coast of Australia, so this is it coming down here. Great Barrier Reef is about 1,500 miles long, and it's the biggest, one of the biggest natural systems on the planet. And the Great Barrier Reef is the second biggest industry in Australia. It generates $11 billion annually. But we have to ask the question of well, how much Great Barrier Reef is actually necessary for tourism? Seeing the entire Great Barrier Reef is almost impossible. It's 1,500 miles long. You're not going to do that easily, especially from underwater. So how much do you need? Is this little bit here enough? And also, what condition? Does it have to be absolutely pristine? Can it be a bit damaged? We don't know. But what Australia did is it realised that, okay, ecotourism itself, is it really sustainable or is it low impact? And what Australia realised is that ecotourism is not low impact at all. It has a huge impact on coral reef ecosystems. Because if you've got people in the water on these coral reefs are very fragile. You have things like this idiot standing on the coral, which is just daft. You can see how all the coral has been eroded on the top because idiots kicking it and knocking it away. In places with lots of divers, you tend to see less branching coral because it's very easy to accidentally kick it. So Australia has realised ecotourism, okay, it's not massively sustainable, it's not even low impact, so we need to divvy up the reef and understand some areas we can almost sacrifice as tourism sites, other areas must stay pristine. So the Great Barrier Reef National Park is the most complexly managed national park in the world. It has multiple different levels of protection. So, and they now have what they call the different zones. So they recognise the tourist impact as different zones. So the highest level of protection is the pink zone, which is called no-go. And in a pink zone, even entry into the national park, even entry into a pink zone is completely forbidden without a permit. If you accidentally sail your boat into a Great Barrier Reef Marine Park pink zone, you receive a massive fine. If you do it twice, your boat is impounded. They do not mess about with their pink zones. They are incredibly highly protected. They're often identified as turtle rookeries or nesting sites, or they have very high levels of endemism. The next zone is the green or no take. In a green zone, you can enter, you can swim, you can snorkel, you can dive, you can sail, but you cannot remove anything. You're not allowed to take anything out at all. One of the islands that we visit is actually in a place, it's in Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Green Zone. You are not allowed to pick a seashell off the beach and take it home with you as a souvenir. That is a complete no. They just have a complete blanket removal. Then you have the orange zone. These are the scientific zones. You can enter and you can conduct research with a permit, and you can take some individuals for scientific research. Next down is the olive green or the buffer zones. They do allow some trawling, but absolutely no bottom fishing or spearing allowed. So you're allowed to put a line in the water and try and catch fish, but no part of your fishing gear is allowed to touch the bottom. So if you're using weight, you have to make sure you've got enough line that it's not going to hit the bottom. Then you have the yellow, the basic park. So here you can go spearfishing and you can even go crabbing. So you can put crab pots on the bottom. And then you have light blue, which is general use. So we have extractive industries allowed, so harvesting and also commercial fishing. So it's a very highly managed area because the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park recognises that tourism and these other industries do generate revenue, but they are not zero impact. So what they've done is, rather than say you can do this, these are the activities that are allowed, they have a highly zoned system, and they have it very, very specific as to what you can do in what place. So some areas are essentially triaged and said, oh, well, this is going to get a bit messed up, but we're going to use the revenue from that to ensure that other areas remain pristine. Okay, so we'll just do a little clicker question here. So what is my attitude to a carbon tax? So A, we should never have a carbon tax. It's unnecessary and it hinders people and businesses. B, it should be on some corporations, but never on consumers. C, I have no opinion either way. D, it should be on some corporations. E, I'm happy to pay. We should always offset the damage we do. Just give you 10 seconds on this. Okay, again, there's no right answer on this one. I just want you to think about what your personal opinions are. Okay, so we're just going to move on to the last part of this class on the Endangered Species Act and what it is. So the Endangered Species Act was tied a bit to the value of biodiversity, and it was enacted in 1973 to conserve species threatened with extinction and the ecosystems on which they depend. The critical thing about the Endangered Species Act that made it very different from a lot of earlier political acts was that it was not just to say this species must continue to exist somewhere on Earth. So, you could say, well, Galapagos giant tortoises are nearly extinct, but if we collect a few of them and we stick them in a zoo, the species is going to survive forever, so that's fine. That's not what the Endangered Species Act says. It not only said you've got to protect the species, you've got to protect the ecosystem on which the species depends. You don't just have the species alive, you have to have wild animals out living in their original ecosystems. And the Endangered Species Act prevents take of endangered species without a permit. It restricts activities that threaten critical habitat. And once species are listed, the recovery and habitat conservation plans are developed with the goal of recovering the species and removing them from the endangered species list. I'm actually involved with one of these recovery plans right now for a species called the Utah prairie dog, and I'm one of the people that is identifying areas where recovery can take place to try and boost the populations. So let's talk for a little bit about grizzly bears in the ESA. So this is a sort of grizzly bear that you might have seen if you've been up to Yellowstone. In this map here, the blue and the green are the sort of historic distribution of grizzly bears. The green, this little bit of green, is the present distribution. So what you notice is that while grizzly bears used to exist all the way through the Midwest and the western states of the US, all the way down into Mexico. Now they exist in a little pocket, that's Yellowstone just there, and they exist in some of the far areas of northern Montana and Washington, and then all through British Columbia, Alberta, and up into Alaska. So they've almost been entirely removed from the lower 48 states and entirely removed from Mexico. think this is a bit interesting because here's the state of California just here. California has a grizzly bear on its flag, but it has no grizzly bears anymore. Like, come on, California, you are not allowed to put an animal on the flag if you have murdered them all. That is a no. In terms of here in Utah, we used to have grizzly bears here. The last one that was killed around in Utah was Old Ephraim, who used to live in Logan Canyon. You can go and visit his grave. So it's a popular biking location. This is Old Ephraim's grave. And his skull is in the Quinney College of Natural Resources in the library, if you want to go and have a look. He was the last grizzly bear that lived here in Utah. So let's think about the grizzly bear in the ESA. Well, in 1975, the grizzly bear was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. So we started a recovery plan, and that was to limit habitat loss due to road building, timber harvest, oil and gas development, mining and recreation. Yellowstone National Park and the surrounding area is now one recovery zone. So the Yellowstone population of grizzly bear was delisted. It was removed from the Endangered Species Act in 2007, but it was then relisted in 2009 due to the potential threats from white bark pine loss. And white bark pine is an important resource for grizzly bears. So the initial recovery plan estimated recovery costs of the grizzly bear at $26 million. And this starts to raise questions. One, is the Endangered Species Act cost effective? Is this investment worth it to save one species and its ecosystem? And also, is the Endangered Species Act successful at conserving biodiversity? Has it done its job? Well, let's look at it through time. So on this we've got a bar chart here. We've got time on the x-axis, a number of taxa, number of species on the y-axis. And we look at the number of vulnerable species, number of threatened species, number of endangered species, number of extinct species, and the number of delisted species. So what are we seeing as we go through time? Well, we're seeing an increase in the number of endangered species. We're seeing an increase in the number of extinct species. And the number of delisted species is relatively small compared to the species that are going extinct and endangered. So this has been used as an argument to say the Endangered Species Act is failing because we are having lots of species go extinct or being classed as endangered and very few species being removed, being delisted from the Endangered Species Act. Now, some folks have gone and said, oh, the Endangered Species Act is great, how it's working. They call it on time and on target. And there have been some spectacular successes with the Endangered Species Act. The black-footed ferret around here has been a huge success because of the Endangered Species Act. But even those species that are delisted, if you start to have a look at why they were delisted, so remember, by 1998, there was about 61 species had been delisted from the ESA. So let's have a look at why they were delisted. Well, 5 of them were extinct, so they're dead. There's no point listing something if it's dead. You can't do a recovery plan for a dead thing. 12 were delisted because they had faulty or incomplete data. One is not being considered for being delisting. 3 recovered as a result of banning the use of pesticides, the peregrine falcon, the bald eagle, and the brown pelican. 9 exist solely on federal lands, and so therefore there's no point designing a recovery plan because they're already on federal lands that are safe. And 3 could be conserved by other laws. So of those delisted species, only 3 of them had actually recovered. So it's a little bit sketchy at times. So by the end of this class, you guys should now be able to list some of the ways biodiversity can be valued, critique whether or not trying to place a value on biodiversity is a good idea, and 3, discuss the success of the ESA in protecting diversity. Okay. That is as far as I wanted to get to today. Thank you, and I shall see you next time.